You know, this is treason. This is cover up. The motive is cover it up and then force everybody to get the vaccines so they can say you had it all along.
When HIV happened, was it a shutdown? Did they shut down the government? Give us that point of view during that time.
It's the gays, it's the IV drug users, it's prostitutes. Don't touch them, don't hug them. Think about everything we're talking about today.
Working with Dr. Anthony Fauci, what kind of influence does he have at that time?
He basically let this disease spread around the world so that he could get glory, fame, and money. One of the things he said was, I want to be on the Tonight Show.
When you say they get the patent and they can brag about it, what does this mean in your world?
Money, 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 everything. Tony Fauci funded the coronavirus studies with Wuhan. They held me in jail trying to get me to kill myself.
How much of you talking about this kind of stuff is what got you in trouble?
We didn't wear a mask ever in my laboratory for HIV.
I mean, what is the real motive behind it?
As the media spins something, and now we have healthy people afraid of healthy people.
The man you're speaking against, he's on TV every other second of the day. Why are you doing this?
When Frank Rossetti came back, he said, you did that for me? And I said, no, asshole, I did it because it's the right thing to do.
30 seconds.
Did you ever think you would make it? I feel I'm so close, I could taste sweet victory. I know this life meant for me. Yeah, why would you bet on Goliath when we got Bet David? Valuetainment, giving values contagious. This world of entrepreneurs, we get no value to haters. How they run, homie, look what I become. I'm the one.
So my guest today is going to give us a history lesson on what's really happened with viruses in the last few decades, because many, many years ago, she had an interaction with Dr. Fauci. Some things that happened to her, I think everybody needs to know about. I know a lot of people are asking about coronavirus. My guest today is Dr. Judy Mikovits. Her background, just so you know, in just over 20 years, she went from entry-level lab technician to the director of the lab of antiviral drug mechanisms at the National Cancer Institute, where she discovered some unique info about retroviruses in vaccine. She has two books out. One of them came out in 2017 called The Plague, When Scientists Interpret Search for the Truth About Human Retroviruses and Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, Autism, and Other Diseases. Right now, it's ranked #1 on Amazon under forensic medicine. And her second book that just came out, I believe April 14th of 2020, I think 10 days ago, Plague for Corruption, Restoring Faith and the Promise of Science. Her first press sold literally in a few hours. It's number one rank right now on Kindle, Amazon on AIDS, #1 book on AIDS, and #1 Kindle book for virology. And that's by Simon & Schuster. And the reason why I say by Simon & Schuster is because I am right now publishing a book through Simon & Schuster. When you write a book through Simon & Schuster, there comes a phase where their attorneys read everything you write, and then they ask you saying, do you have proof of this? Do you have proof of that? Do you have proof of this? Because Simon & Schuster has to protect what you're writing about, because many times when you write things, there are lawsuits. So if somebody self-publishes a book, it's a different story versus you going to a company like Simon & Schuster that publishes a book. I say that for the viewers to know the credibility of my guest today. She was awarded Graduate Student of the Year in 1991. She cooperated with the FBI during an investigation of Dr. Anthony Fauci, which we'll get to that. She was a fugitive on the run, hiding on a boat for 4 days. Her story sounds more like a movie, but it's an actual real life story. Having said that, Dr. Judy Mikovits, thanks for being a guest on Valuetainment today.
Nice to be here, Pat.
So Dr. Judy, I'm just curious, a lot of times when, you ask somebody, why did you become a soldier? Oh, because my dad was a general. So why did you become a real estate? Oh, my mom was in real estate. What inspired you to go out there and want to do what you've done your entire life?
Well, it's actually because when I was, maybe 10 or 12 years old, my grandfather got lung cancer. And so at that time, cancer was a closet disease. Nobody said anything about it. It was, nobody knew if it was infectious. Nobody knew anything. So it was, and so I thought, well, we should be able to understand what causes cancer and how to treat it, like with food and with plants. So I went to University of Virginia and got a degree in chemistry with a specialization in biology. I think of the 128 hours I took between 1976 and 1980, I took 124 hours in science, biology, science, physics, math, and 4 hours of German because it was required to get a chemistry degree. I didn't take an English class. I didn't take a history class. I had placed out of all of that. And it's interesting because you'll see in Plague of Corruption, it goes into a little bit more of the story. Plague's a little bit too much science for most people. So we wrote Plague of Corruption when we really understood what this was all about. I had no idea in 2014 when we wrote Plague. So, and so we tell the story. We went right back and said, and that was my passion. It was everything. And when I did, so I didn't get in medical school because we didn't have any money. And so I thought what I'll do on March 31st, 1980, the cover of Time magazine was a hypodermic needle with a drop coming out. It was the big if, interferon, the magic bullet for cancer. The reason I remember it like it was yesterday is it was the day before my birthday.
Wow.
And the only job offers I was getting was to go to oil companies in Texas. And I really didn't want to do that. So I saw that magazine and I heard first. I didn't even know it was a cancer institute. And so then I answered an ad in the Washington Post because I'm from the Washington area. My sister was living in Vienna, and that I lived with my sister there that summer.
Nice.
And I answered a job in the Washington Post looking for a biochemist to purify interferon. And I'm like, that's the job. I'm going to go spend 1 or 2 years learning how to cure cancer, and then I'll go back to medical school. And it ended up being 40 years. So
that's unbelievable. So if I was in high school with you, you're 15, 16, we're classmates. Who were you in high school?
In high school, I was the angry kid with a chip on my shoulder from a divorced family. I had a high school teacher say, I told him I was going to be a doctor, and he laughed because I didn't do well in science classes. I did well in independent study if a teacher would just let me go. And I had my favorite high school teacher was Ann Peabody. She was my English teacher, and she let me do independent study. And she actually, I got a scholarship to go to University of Virginia because my family, I was the only kid to go to university out of 4 kids. And in fact, Elizabeth Dole, they lived in the area of the Congress and Senate. So Elizabeth Dole was a friend of Ann Peabody, and she and they helped me get a scholarship to University of Virginia. Ann said, this is a kid that needs to go to college. So I ended up there, and it was there, kind of the rest was history. So I wouldn't even, I was such a wahoo and a Virginian that I didn't want to admit I was working in Maryland, and, not going to do that.
Not proud.
Yeah.
Very, very cool. So what's the next transition of you going from there to being a doctor and then studying the topics that you did?
Well, when I was first doing, so we purified interferon, that was fun, put it into people. And at that time, the first human cancer causing retrovirus, a virus like HIV AIDS, it's just a family of RNA viruses like a coronavirus. Who cares what they name them? The first cancer causing retrovirus family was identified by who ended up being my lifelong mentor and colleague, Dr. Frank Rossetti. So I was told in the job, my next job after interferon was to purify that retrovirus using an open air piece of equipment that could have aerosolized it, could have spread it through the air. And we didn't know anything about the transmission. We're 22, 23 years old. Many of the technicians were newly married, and some even pregnant. And so my boss, a young man of 30, and I, we were just, and we said, we wrote a letter. And we said, there's no safety here. There's no safety in place. This is really unethical. And they said, you make it. And this was Bob Gallo's lab, Robert Gallo, who was also in the National Cancer Institute.
Was Bob Gallo the one that was working under Dr. Fauci at that time, or no? Was he
He
working
was,
with
he
Anthony
was
Fauci?
working with him. He was working with him.
with him.
They were in different divisions, but again, Frank Rossetti was a postdoctoral fellow who made the discoveries in Bob Gallo's lab, and Bob Gallo fired him because he was getting too much credit. Just going to let you go to this old boys corrupt network. This is I was only the second class of women at the University of the Arts and Sciences, something other than nursing or education. And the first class was one that Katie Couric was in 1975. So still, so interesting. But at any rate, this is, the Old Boys Network is alive and well, especially in the sciences. So we purified the stuff. We made the virus. We did the work. We made sure that pregnant women, we just put them on other projects. And Mark and I did it by ourselves, sleeping there almost around the clock because he had a new baby at home. So we didn't want to risk anybody getting infected. And so as soon as we finished the project, I got a letter from the government saying my job had been eliminated and they didn't need a protein chemist in the fermentation program, and I was the only one. So I went to listen to a seminar that day, thinking, boy, what's my family going to think? I don't get into med school. Now I've lost this job, and losing this job, I'll never get into medical school. And here I am, I'm done as far as a scientist goes. And so I go to a seminar and I hear about these things called cytokines, and Joe Oppenheim, actually a survivor. He's Dutch, Joost, Joost, fabulous man, discovered, IL-1, IL-8 in his lab, was leading this program in the biological response modifiers program. And I rarely do this. After he gave a seminar, I said, those things just might be able to cure cancer. And he didn't laugh. He just said, kid, hey, it's after lunch in the seminar. Why don't you come? Let's have a talk. And he said, I know this guy, Frank Rossetti, who needs a technician. I think you might just, and so that started a very interesting and lifelong companionship that really goes to my first interaction with Tony Fauci, which wasn't a good one. So
your first interaction with Tony Fauci wasn't a good one. Now, is this post you working on AIDS and HIV, or is this pre?
Pre.
This is pre. So what was your, I know when you're working with Frank, you've been working with Dr. Frank for June 6th is going to be 37 years, right?
Correct.
That's a long time, obviously. So it's somebody you trust, somebody that's a colleague that you trust to be able to be in business with them for 37 years. So walk us through what happened, what events led to your interaction, the phone call you got from Dr. Anthony Fauci.
So I'm Frank's technician starting June 6, 1983. And the project he gave me a couple of choices. And I chose the one because we were looking at otherwise healthy men, beautiful, healthy men who were getting opportunistic infections. That one of them was Kaposi sarcoma. That's a cancer, that ugly cancer, that blood type things on you that usually only old men in the southern tip of Italy get. And so it's like, why is it at UCLA? And so we were starting to see around the world pockets of disease that made no sense. Different TB, thrush, different kind of infections that we call opportunistic infections now. We didn't at the time. So everybody was looking, and because Frank had already discovered the first retrovirus, understanding what he understood about how they work, we thought this could be a retrovirus. And then Luc Montagnier, Nobel laureate, called Frank one day and said, hey, we're gonna send people and have you to Bob Gallo's lab and our postdoc, and have him help teach us how to isolate the virus. And Frank told him I wouldn't do that. And he told him exactly why. And history did repeat itself, but we won't go there right now. So we go ahead and we said, we'll help you. We'll teach you. And it was just the two of us. Frank wasn't allowed to have more than one technician for quite a number of years because, again, he was getting too much credit. So we isolated the virus from the saliva and the blood of one of the patients, from the original patients from the French Canadian. You really need to go back to the original patients in cohorts because there can be strain differences and it'll look different. So you really want that sick person. If they're not sick, you're not likely to isolate the virus or find it there. And that's really critical when you think about, I mentioned that we isolated it from saliva. So would that mean that HIV is contagious in that way, where if you share water or wine or meal or get it on the food, you can actually become infected? And that didn't turn out to be true unless you were with the sickest of patients. So yes, we isolated them there, but you wouldn't consider that virus contagious. Anyway, we isolated it and we had a paper in press. I'm a technician. Technicians don't co-author papers, not in that time. They do now, but they didn't then. So Frank was out of town at a meeting. I'm the technician. We have one office and one lab. So I answer the phone and it's Bob Gallo, and Tony Fauci. I think Tony Fauci was on the phone. And the office doors open so that the rest of the students and techs can hear me. And I answered the phone and he said, I understand you have a manuscript in press. We need a copy of it. And Dr. Rossetti, I said, Dr. Rossetti's out of town. I'm sorry, it's confidential. It's in press. It's unethical for me to give that to you. And he started literally screaming at me. Both of them were on the call. I could hear Bob Gallo's voice that I now know. And they're in Bethesda. We're in Frederick. And he's like, give me the paper or you're fired for insubordination. Well, I just got fired a minute ago, so I'm pretty good at that. It's like, it's not a problem right now because I'm starting to understand how the government works. And I just said, I'm sorry, it's unethical and I can't give it to you. I'm sure when Dr. Rossetti comes back, he'll give you a copy of the paper. But this was a problem, you see, because Bob Gallo couldn't isolate the virus. So when Frank came back, he bullied him into giving him a copy of the paper. They held up our paper in press, Frank's paper in press, and while Bob Gallo copied the results and came out with his own paper and said, hey, we discovered it first, and it's not your virus. We got it from other samples, not the ones that you sent. So we've got a new virus. And history really repeats itself because it's so clear in the 30 years later, literally exactly what happened to Frank Rossetti happened to me as our careers were ruined, and similarly. So, and that's part of the story in Plague of Corruption. So once we learned in 2014 what this story was all about, then we wrote the simple book. Plague of Corruption is what I now understand. It had nothing to do with science and everything to do with covering up inconvenient truths. And now I know so much more. I learn more every day. So this book started literally in 2014 when I first saw Brian Hooker give a talk. And what Brian Hooker gave a talk August 31st, 2014. And he showed a page of the notebook of William Thompson, the guy who confessed that he covered up for 20 years and committed fraud in a scientific paper that vaccines, MMR, can and does cause autism in susceptible little black boys under the age of 3. The fourfold risk if little black boys are given that vaccine before the age of 3. And his notebook page had a taped in email to everyone on the project, which the authors of the paper, which you have to do. And it said in his handwriting, what are we going to do about the problem with the blacks? And
who said this again?
Brian, Dr. Thompson, and Dr. Hooker dogged him for 15 years, who had an injured son, and dogged him for 15 years with FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request. So that the light bulb went on that day after we wrote that incredibly scientific book, Plague, and I thought it was about science. So just like I was explaining a few minutes ago, I thought this was all about science. And the big, oh my God, is this has nothing to do with science. This is a big cover up, and some of our work had shown that same thing.
Can we go back to your experience with Dr. Anthony Fauci? At that time, he's 79 years old right now, so 1984. We're talking about
45. Yeah.
He was 45. But who was he? Already a credible voice? Was he somebody that was as was he as known? Was he as powerful, or not yet?
Not yet, but he was a credible voice, but he didn't take, I don't think he got the job as the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease until, the paper with HIV, because that's one of the things he said was, I want to be on the Tonight Show. They didn't care about millions of people dying. It's like, how are they going to position themselves? And it was horrible to watch.
He said this?
Yeah, and so Cliff Lane, Bob Gallo, and Tony Fauci all had their reasons for, publishing second this paper, for, taking the credit away from Luc Montagnier and the French and making this all their own. They held up, and they did that. They held up the paper so it wouldn't get published for months. They held up a diagnostic test. They wrote the patents to themselves for the discoveries, which weren't theirs. And you can see many things about this in books like science fictions and things like that. You can see through Charles Ortlieb's new book on Tony Fauci. But Charles was an advocate in New York. And he was writing about both chronic fatigue syndrome and HIV and AIDS when we didn't know much about it. And they were accusing the government of keeping the drugs, keeping the things away from people. And they were, of course, right. So he basically changed, let this disease spread around the world so that he could get glory, fame, and money.
So at this point, HIV, AIDS, the number I read about right now is 32 million people have died from it, and 40 million people in Africa have HIV positive or HIV positive today. This is some data I'm seeing based on what I'm reading. So just to go back during that time, a 40-year-old may not remember, and even a 50-year-old may not remember, if you go back to it. So you would have to be in your mid-50s to kind of remember how the news, the media, and you have to follow it to kind of know what happened. Mm-hmm. When HIV happened, if you can kind of tell us the conditions when it happened, what was the news saying? What was the media saying? How afraid were people? What kind of reactions did we have? Just think about the average person that wasn't there at that time. Was there a pandemic? Was it a shutdown? Did they shut down the government? What happened? Give us that point of view during that time. You're in it.
Yeah, I'm in it. In fact, it's directly related to me because Frank said to me, Judy, are you afraid? I don't want to put you, we don't know anything about this. We're isolating the virus. So all we know is healthy young men are getting all these strange diseases and dying. They're cachectic, they're thin, they look like cancer patients. Their immune systems are destroyed. And then you're going to try to isolate a virus. I'm literally handling them. And what do they do to them? Don't touch them. It was just like my grandfather. Don't tell him he has cancer because we don't know how it causes. Don't touch them. Don't hug them. Think about everything we're talking about today. Stay 6 feet away. The psychological trauma to the patients. Don't hug them. Don't touch them. At the time I left the cancer, it was that kind of thing. But it was only them. And they said, it's only them. It's their bad behavior. It's the gays, it's the IV drug users, it's prostitutes. That's God's that's punishment for their behavior. So a country of Christians, said, oh, bad people. And I remember so clearly going to scientific meetings, and I fell prey to the culture myself. And I can say 30 years later, I'm ashamed of myself. But that I went to meetings where there were protesters that blocked the scientists from going into the meeting, and they're saying scientists are murderers, or what the science says. And I thought to myself, I'm working 24/7 to find a cure for your bad behavior. And you're throwing, they used to throw balloons full of red fluid that were condoms full of red fluids at you at a baseball stadium in a meeting in Montreal. This was maybe 1990. So I went to these meetings as scientists, and I didn't realize we had all kinds of posters of treatments that would work. And we weren't the government keeping them from getting these treatments. We were, we were just scientists doing our job. And I think it really shows what's going on now as the media spins something. And now we have healthy people afraid of healthy people, especially healthy children. We're all wearing masks and have to stay 6 feet away. And the masks are injuring ourselves. So this was the culture in literally from 1980s through, and I didn't want a PhD. I actually left the Cancer Institute. I wasn't going to go back to graduate school. And the stories are all told in Plague of Corruption, because we walked through my life. And I went to work at a pharmaceutical company, Upjohn, and we were making some good drugs and doing some things, but we had to understand if the biological therapies would be contaminated if they had animal or human blood in them. And I simply did the test to spike it with a lot of HIV, and then ask if the process, the manufacturing process, could remove 6 logs of infectivity. That is, if the virus was there, if even one contaminated unit of blood or whatever we were using, animal tissue, had a virus there, we could pull it out with the process. And what Upjohn did with me is I had to do those experiments back in Frank's lab in the National Cancer Institute, because they said, we don't have HIV in Michigan. So for years, in 1987, remember I isolated in 1983. So for years, there's no HIV. It's only those people, until Arthur Ashe and Ryan White, until the little boy, the hemophiliac, multiply transfused, until Arthur Ashe got a heart transplant and acquired. And this is the subject of the movie and the book, The Band Played On, by Randy Shilts. And so, and that's how I wrote this book. How we wrote these 2 books was to go through what we knew. So the fact that, this is what I call the God thing, that Frank and Vercetti and I stayed together all these years. I left Upjohn because my other project was to show that bovine growth hormone, that is making GMOs, making cows make more milk by engineering the GMO, bovine growth hormone, some called it somatostat, to make more milk, wouldn't hurt human cells. And my work said anything but. My work said it absolutely hurt human cells. It can drive diabetes. It can drive adipocytes to the explosion of obesity we see. And of course, GMOs do that. So I was told that day that I showed the data, and I said, no, those aren't the data. They do hurt human cells. And my boss said, you're morally, ethically, and legally responsible to do exactly as I told you. And I had a boyfriend up there that was a Frisbee champion. So I took the notebook like a Frisbee, and up the bulletin board dropped behind him. And the personnel manager couldn't hide his laugh, because he liked me. I played on a soccer team. So that was a
Wow.
dog. I could run all day.
So in essence, I mean, when I'm reading, the fact when they say you save millions of people's lives, so you guys essentially came up with a way to save people, prevent them, so the average person understands, from getting AIDS. That's what you ended up doing.
Correct, by showing the exact immune response. So the T cells, only 1 in 10,000. So the personnel director said, Judy, you can't throw things at your boss. And I said, that's okay. I got to go back home. My stepfather has aggressive prostate cancer. So I called Frank and I said, okay, We agreed never to say the G word in our lab. I didn't say Gallo, and he didn't say graduate school. And so I said I have to go because my stepfather lost his first wife to cancer, and his 5 children wouldn't survive if they thought their father had cancer. So I said, I got to do something. It's time to go to graduate school. So I went on the hypothesis at the time in 1987, it was the T cell that was getting infected, that in the immune system. Doesn't matter, they're two, let's just say, the innate and the adaptive. So the T cells, we knew they were all dying. Why were they dying? Only 1 in 10,000 was infected. Somebody else had to be the shooter. Who's shooting the T cells? What is happening? It's indirect. We call it damage from a distance. So, and we proposed the hypothesis that turned out to be my award-winning thesis, because it said the macrophage, which is the innate immune response, it's your troops. They surveil all your mucosal surfaces. They go in your skin, in your blood, in your brain. Every body system has their troops ready to go. And they sense everything, and they act like little Pac-Men, and they gobble them right up. Anything that comes in, not just viruses, but microbes, toxins, environmental toxins. That's that part of your immune system. So that was the shooter. And so I showed how the virus was like a Trojan horse, and it hid in the macrophage, and certain environmental toxins would wake it up. It was asleep. Wake it up, and then it infected more and more of the cells and crippled the other immune system. So my thesis basically said, you got to treat them as soon as you know there's any evidence of infection and prevent disease development. And that's what we did. So Magic Johnson was the first to do that treatment, and it took quite a heroic thing. So my PhD thesis was defended on November 14th, 1991. Magic Johnson was in the newspaper November 7th in the USA Today. And it basically said, and has having come up seropositive, meaning he had an antibody to HIV. Nobody looked at the sequences. Nobody looked at whatever. He's infected because he's got an antibody. He's been exposed. And so they said, based on your thesis at the molecular level, will he or will he not die of AIDS? And I said, if he changes everything in how he's treated, then you can see. And he was on the cover of Time magazine. Again, we're going to just follow Time magazine, 1991. So nobody wanted, it was one thing when the deplorables were all dying. I shouldn't use that word. When the susceptible, it was your bad behavior. But this is Magic Johnson. This is, he's strong as an ox when everybody can get it. That's fearful. He's not gay. It's not, he's not an IV drug user. He's a basketball player where in a routine test, he has to get tested for HIV. And we still do that to this day. And they have to get certain vaccines, sports players, which again, drive pandemic. So at any rate, so this is, so I defended my thesis. David Ho is the medical doctor in New York City. He was on the cover of Time magazine somewhere. I think he was even Man of the Year that year for just taking the treatment. I have a PhD thesis. That's not a published document. We had 2 or 3 papers where the old boys corrupt network said, oh, you're an idiot, your samples are contaminated. We're used to this. And of course, my thesis committee saw otherwise when they heard the molecular description. And when my papers would go into press before my PhD thesis, they'd say, I didn't believe your last paper either. I mean, that's peer review in our society. And most people just don't understand how things get into journal and how that changes the culture, and how, what I call COVID-19 is propaganda masquerading as science, because there's no science in it.
Let me ask you this, Dr. Judy. By the way, thank you for sharing that. That was very helpful to kind of see the process of going from there to now. So at that time, Dr. Fauci's 45 when he called you with Gallo and you're on the phone with him. Frank at that time is in his early 30s. Is that a pretty accurate statement?
No, Frank's almost his same age.
Frank's the same age as Dr. Fauci.
Correct.
Okay, Frank's, and then how old are you at that time?
25.
When you were 25?
Yeah.
25. Okay. So this is taking place. And for someone that doesn't know, is not in that world, how big of a deal is it for Gallo and Fauci to say, no, you know, let us look at the paper. Frank eventually gives it to Gallo. They rewrite it. And then they say, we came up with it first. And then they get the patent. When you say they get the patent and they can brag about it, what does this mean in your world? Both respect-wise, both written about, both money-wise, economically. What does it mean when you say they got the patent and they got the credit for it?
Well, it means everything, because then you get things like the Lasker Award. Then you get, then you get positions. Then your laboratory gets funded. Then you can do much more work. It means everything from the standpoint of, everything that comes after that. You're given the credit for other people's work, and you didn't participate at all. You basically stole it. But in the world view, the U.S. tends to say, oh, the French, they don't know anything. We discovered it first. We're the U.S. in medicine. And taking Luc Montagnier and Francois did the work. They recognized the patients. That's the most important thing. Find the patients, know what you're looking at. And then, it's our job to know how to grow viruses. That's what Frank did. That's what I learned to do from the time I was 25. And so it's everything. And so you don't get funding if you don't publish in science. You don't get awards.
Got it.
Money, everything.
So that helps get even more funding once you can show that you have all these patents. And by the way, is that when 6 months later he got promoted to being the director? Is that when he got the promotion or no?
Correct. That's when he got the promotion.
So 6 months later, he got the promotion. He's had it ever since.
Correct.
And what kind of power does that give Dr. Fauci? So once you become the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, what kind of influence does he have at that time?
Well, at that time, given HIV/AIDS, it's the biggest thing in our country, in our world, as far as an infectious disease, because we don't really have infectious disease issues. HTLV1, the leukemia-causing virus, was very rare in our country. It was endemic in Japan. And so quickly we shut that down with protective measures. Don't breastfeed too long. Don't transmit through blood. There are ways to prevent the spreads of retroviruses, which weren't done in the case of HIV. And I will always argue is because it was intended to get rid of those people, and kill a specific population. And there's no evidence to say that isn't what was happening. And that's what Charles Ortleb was writing about. And the reason I wrote his name down is because I asked Frank a few weeks ago, and he said, yeah, I used to edit his newspaper to make sure it was scientifically correct. So, and it had to do right then. And I didn't know until a couple of weeks ago, it was not just AIDS, but it was CFS, chronic fatigue syndrome. So these two always were retroviruses, and they knew it. And they literally, what was worse than being tired? What is the stigma? Chronic fatigue syndrome. And Bobby wrote it really well. And it's usually women. So now here's a population, and what they wrote, and I didn't know this, and he did the research on his own for the foreword. I never saw it. And Bobby went back to the newspapers, and here's women who just couldn't handle the stress of big business. Just stay out. You can't play with the old boys. You're fatigued. You're bedridden. You're lazy. What is this? And it's the bias put on a people and a stigma. This shouldn't have been the name. The name of the disease is myalgic encephalomyelitis. Sorry about that. It means inflammation of the brain and spinal cord. And so instead of a scientific disease, they made it, you're crazy, you're not sick, you're just lazy. And in a world where at the time, again, I'm running marathons and riding centuries on my bike, the worst thing in the world was to be lazy and tired. And so the same stigma that was put on, it was the behavior that led to the disease and not an infectious agent. So NIAID was essentially nothing then. But this gave, the DTP injury, diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, that vaccine was causing a great deal of injury in the late 70s and early 80s. and that's in the book as well. And you can, maybe you'd like to have on your show Michael R. Hugo, the attorney that after he saw the first book, he called me up and he said, "You have no idea what you stepped in." And I said, "No, I have no idea. Why don't you tell me?" And this man's a fabulous story. I had nowhere to go. I'm literally on house arrest, and for 5 years I can't talk to anybody. So anyway, so that now the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease is essentially next to the National Cancer Institute, everything. You know, he really controls NIH. Yes, Collins, Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, is Tony Fauci's puppet. And I'm sorry that I have, you know, there's a lot of data to suggest that. He's a good man. He's not an evil man. He can't conceive of some of this. He's directing, and, you know, in September when I gave the talk and he asked the question, September 6th of 2010, about this other family of mouse viruses jumping into humans, Francis Collins said, where did you get the controls? Where did you get your healthy controls? And I said, the blood supply of London. So we've got 4% in the blood supply of London. Again, this is 25 times HIV, which was never more in our blood supply, never approaching even 1%. And even less, we don't even test for HTLV, or at least we hadn't for the last few years. So these things don't end up in the blood supply because our immune systems can really handle it, as long as you educate the immune system to do that. And it's never been with a vaccine, despite trillions of dollars that Tony Fauci's been paid to develop vaccines for these viruses. That's under his control.
That's under his control.
The entire vaccine program, which started in 1999, under his control.
So let me ask you, going back to it during the AIDS, just out of curiosity, was there ever a shutdown when that pandemic took place? Did U.S. ever shut down the way we are shut down today?
Oh, absolutely not.
Absolutely not. So everything was
no.
business as usual. So for somebody like you watching this from then, working with Dr. Anthony Fauci, you know, where you had some kind of a relationship going back and forth with him, and seeing him get promoted to the director, then now seeing the recommendation with shutting down all of it, what are you thinking seeing these two things taking place?
Well, you know, I'm incredibly angry because it has no basis in science. And even more important than in 1983 and 84, we only thought certain behaviors caused this. But again, in 2011, with our paper on the new family of these contagious cancer-causing viruses, and they didn't do anything to give safety. They actually downgraded it to biosafety level 2. We didn't wear a mask ever in my laboratory for HIV. You don't wear a mask because you don't touch your face. Never wore a mask with all 30 years of research. And here we have cancer-causing mouse viruses, which were called biosafety level 2, meaning you only have to wear gloves. You don't have to wear a mask. And our colleagues were getting infected and getting sick in 2011, clear from the air. I seroconverted. I got sick, clear from the air. I got infected. I'm not sick yet because I know how to fix this, right? We got that 10 years ago. So you're infecting the lab workers. You're infecting the first responders. You're infecting the military, because you're forcing the injection on them. Lab workers were encouraged to get vaccines. And of course, we're thinking, well, yeah, we don't want to catch that. So in the case of back with HIV, Frank, when the hepatitis B vaccine became available, and this is the book, again, the book and the movie the band played on, they thought hepatitis B was a cofactor driving the disease, along with other infectious agents. And so they encouraged everyone in the laboratory working with patients to get the vaccine. But they they mandated the deplorables, the original susceptible, sorry, I'll stop using that term. They mandated the original susceptible population. And that's only my disgust. I mean, I'm right now, I'm angry and I'm disgusted because, you know, when you did nothing to stop women who are already infected, lab workers who are already infected with this agent in 2009, in chapter 8 of our original book was an invitation only meeting with the highest levels of the government, the FDA, the CDC, you know, and there's one person curiously absent, and that was Tony Fauci, because he's known for 30 years, and we haven't, that he shut down the idea that a chronic fatigue syndrome is an infectious disease, despite the fact that I wasn't the first woman whose career was destroyed because she isolated and identified a similar virus associated with chronic fatigue syndrome. So for 30 years, this man's been destroying the careers of women and scientists, and he stays in the background, like I call it the Wizard of Oz. He's behind the screen, and he's the little man, the little puppet, and people are all dancing to him because he controls the money, he controls the journals. Well, Francis Collins was, when I said the blood supply, everybody knows what happened and how HIV spread around the world, and to the innocent victims like Arthur Ashe and Ryan White and even Magic Johnson. You know, it was put on his bad behavior. That's a cultural thing. But, you know, the vaccine, again, the vaccines were made in human plasma at the time, and nobody had identified the viruses we did. A similar thing, even though Charles Ortlieb is working on AIDS, and the woman's disease is called chronic fatigue syndrome, equally derogatory. And here you are. So I'm angry right now because the mitigation steps, the prevention, the educate the immune system, every single thing that comes out of his mouth is to drive towards his patents. And literally, you know, we have spent, you know, at least 20 years, and all the data, you know, these vaccines in these viruses, not only the AIDS and the CFS infectious agents, but the coronaviruses. We've tried since SARS, the severe acute respiratory virus #1. This one is called severe acute respiratory coronavirus #2. And the MERS, the Middle East respiratory syndrome virus, those two, the vaccine development's been going for 20 years. And every piece of data says that if you give the vaccine, you actually drive the disease, and the next infection could kill them. So there are terms called viral interference and other thing. We don't need to talk about it, but the data is clear. The vaccine, they're driving the disease and killing the people, especially when they, you know, unwittingly see the vaccine, see the virus again. So that all of that knowledge has been there. The flu vaccines driving the pandemic that we are here. And there's 3 or 4 publications over the last 10 years. We know that driving I call it the evolution. You know, it's not a natural evolution for a virus to go from a bat to a human, because it kills all the human cells. And in 1999 and 97 through 99, and as part of my postdoctoral studies, I was working in that Fort Detrick Biosafety Level 4 facility. It's called USAMRIID, U.S. Army Research Institute of Infectious Disease. It's a military post. That was a biowarfare division, Fort Detrick. The pictures are in the middle of the second book. You know, the Cancer Institute and the biowarfare are right next to each other across a baseball field. So again, I went over there to work with Ebola, and my job was to understand why certain strains of Ebola killed human cells and others didn't. And so what you get is that landscape, that signature of disease, because it's the immune system that overreacts. It's the immune system that overreacts to the injection of the RNA or the nucleic acid. The vaccine is an injection. So but we've come to really bastardize the definition of vaccine developing immunity, when in fact they don't.
How much of you talking about this kind of stuff is what got you in trouble? of you getting arrested? What led to your arrest the first time? What caused that?
I never talked about this stuff. I had no idea until that day I met Brian Hooker and saw his notebook. And then I understood the whole thing. I didn't work in vaccines. I mean, I worked in immune therapy, which is a type of vaccine, but it wasn't for in that it wouldn't be called a vaccine. It would be called immune therapy for cancer. That's what we did, and AIDS. So what got me in trouble and got me arrested and got me hunted down is when our work when I presented to the New York Academy of Sciences March 29th, 2011, when I presented our work that said the blood supply was, at least 10 times more heavily contaminated with, this family of viruses than in the HIV days. I refused to cover up the data and say I'd made a mistake, that the blood supply wasn't contaminated, because the country could not afford that. HIV has practically bankrupted the world. Look at how many, as we've talked about, and it didn't have to either, because of course we can treat that. But again, we're always driving toward we're going to cure it. We've got a disease. Well, we already cured it in 1991. But see, this isn't the way science is spun, and President Trump, every administration. So it's not it's a bipartisan problem, because one man's been standing next to every president predicting these pandemics, from swine flu to bird flu and H1N1, Zika, Ebola of 2014. And there's no question the viruses kill people, a susceptible population, but the answer is never and won't be a vaccine. So why are we locking down the world and putting people in masks, and which injures yourself? It immune suppresses you, especially if you get a vaccine, because now you're inhaling that virus and amplifying it over and over and over again, and you could die from that vaccine and wearing a mask alone.
I got this article here. November 22nd, 2011, from Chicago Tribune reporter. I think it's important for the audience to kind of see this, because all of this is bringing the amount of influence, whether it's big pharma, whether it's control, whether it's vaccination, whatever it may be, depopulation, reducing population growth. All of this is kind of coming together. And this was written all over the place. This is just one of the articles I took out. You can see several different links. This is November 22nd, 2011. Title says, Discredited Chronic Fatigue Researcher in California Jail. Okay. 2 years ago, researcher Judy Mikovits was writing atop a wave of promise. She had published one of the most discussed papers of the year in one of the most prestigious scientific publications in the world. Her team's findings were hailed as potential breakthrough for an endless chronic fatigue syndrome that had long frustrated researchers. She was invited to speak at scientific conferences around the globe. Adoring patients crowded her at her talks. I mean, it talks about what you did, and then you said this is a proud moment because I've had people calling me from Dubai, China, you name it, they're contacting me. So this is at the top of, would you say this was at the top of your career at this time, right before this event taking place, like middle of 2011?
Yeah.
It was. And then this happens. What led to this event? I'm curious to know what led to this event.
Well, as the data from that March 29th talk went on, as our colleague, and I won't name him, reported that the biologicals that were likely transmitting these viruses were vaccines, as the studies from other people, myself, my team, showed the link to autism, as it appeared ITP, which is a blood disease that's associated with MMR. It's listed as a side effect of some people with MMR, as the cancers and the disease associations, and the realization of how many strains of these viruses, we can't even tell you how many, have entered humans. It should have said, everything needs to stop. We've got a tremendous problem. And so what led up to that is we were encouraged to retract our findings and not discuss the blood supply being contaminated, but to publish studies that were called failure to confirm, just like other investigators were literally, I call it commission fraud, because they were paid They were given grants from NIAID and other places. They would otherwise not get grants. They were publishing papers in that same journal, Science, that were actually violation of things like our human subjects review boards and things like that. They were invited to publish really quickly by the CDC, by other people, to cover up the data, and I just simply would not fold. These patients, you know, and I wrote an email August 31st of 2011 to the head of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. Her name's Simone Glenn, and I copied Frank Rossetti. And I wrote the email and said, I'm not covering it up. That's not an association study. That paper's not coming out that way, that you will not rush to publish this. And basically said, you know, I'll write a dissenting opinion if I have to. You can publish whatever you want, but Frank Rossetti and I won't sign our names to this because this is fraud. And 3 days later, I get a phone call saying, and it's Simone Glenn on one line, and Michael Bush, in San Francisco, the head of the Blood Systems Research Institute. And you can follow the people on the papers, the authors. He was the senior author on that paper. And it was very clear the blood supply was heavily contaminated, and we didn't have a good diagnostic test because we had too many strains of viruses. So you can't do a PCR, you can't do a serology test because it's a conformational epitope. That means shape, not a sequence. So the test that Abbott has is a sequence, and that's null and void. It's never found a positive anywhere. So they lose their patents, they lose their money, they lose the investigators. The other investigators are going to lose their careers, their lives. They're not going to be funded anymore. And they know that. And every person on the paper essentially, has been paid since that time in grants they didn't earn. All of mine were taken away from me. And I was told on that Labor Day Monday that if that paper weren't ready to come out in time for the IACFS meeting, the International Association of CFS. It was held in Ottawa, Canada that year, and I'm supposed to debate John Coffin on the association of this virus family, and he's purporting his, recombination theory never happened, never will again. That's the chapter of the first book called The Immaculate Recombination. And I could tell you why we called it that, but at any rate, because it never happened the first time. It was pure fraud. And some investigators caught him in changing the sequences in the gene bank or encouraging that the sequences be changed. We made a little mistake when we sequenced the virus in order to put together this. At any rate, so this is another paper I have here. So Science, the journal, you can see there it says false positive. So my bosses own a company, the heads of the institutes own a company that's been doing a diagnostic test. They don't have anything to do with my research program or the institute. They're on their own doing a diagnostic test that Michael Bush wrote in emails and was unvalidated, that had not done enough negative controls. And so here the day before that meeting or after that meeting or before is false positive. So if you sell a test to Medicare and it's not validated, and you do tell a patient they have a virus they don't have, that's a federal crime. Okay, and a lot of other crimes. So the fact of the matter is the tests weren't false positive. So, again, I'm told on the phone on August 31st, if I don't say in that same meeting that I made a mistake and there's no viruses and I'm wrong and we can all go home now, and I literally, the apology as I'm being held in jail on November 22nd, when the article you read came out, I'm held in a Ventura jail for 5 days without an arrest warrant. I'm taken from my home. They come in, they try to find literally create a crime. They fabricate a mugshot, and Science the Journal finds all of this. The man named John Cohen, he follows all of this. He's not part of a scientific journalist. He works for the op-ed part of the magazine. So he's just propaganda. He's just editorializing or propaganda. And so at that time, in back all the way on June 2nd, when 2 negative papers that were commission fraud came out, in Science the Journal, the journal editor said, okay, I've seen enough. I'm concerned. The author should retract the paper. And we wrote, Dr. Rossetti and I wrote a detailed letter and showed it to every investigator on the paper of all the scientific data that said the only thing that was wrong with the paper was figure 1, which belonged to Bob Silverman, and the PCR test not detecting the viruses. In fact, it was false negative. And he held the patent, and Abbott's paying his laboratory there in Cleveland. And so again, everybody has a conflict of interest but us. So the journal agreed, we won't retract. We'll only partial retract. So as I'm held in jail, the journal says we have no choice but to force the retraction of the paper. So the arrest, it's scare you. It's get you to kill yourself. And they hunted me down and on more than one occasion tried to kill me. So the time you mentioned, the 4 days, it was actually, 5 days I hid on a boat because I lived in Oxnard in the Channel Islands Harbor, and we had a boat dock home with a couple of boats. And at 4 a.m, our house is surrounded. That chapter in the book is called Scientist at Sea. And we go into great detail of what happened that day with my husband. And I was on my way to a job interview. I'd already been fired 6 weeks earlier. And with all the grants I had and the ability to study this big discovery, and there were drug developers who were saying, hey, we don't have a problem that you don't have a diagnostic test. We see your data. We believe the data, just like the editors of Science said all that summer. So the only answer somebody had was to carry out the threats. And I gave the talk I wasn't supposed to give. I was fired within a week of that talk as I stood on the sidewalk. I never went back there. My entire laboratory was locked out automatically, and they literally set up a crime, Watergate style. Let's make it look like she went crazy, went in there, took the notebooks, took the stuff. She made it all up for her greater glory, and what you just read there, and I don't care about that stuff. And it just again, but my postdoc, my student, was angry, and he said, Judy, you don't understand. And I'm Pollyanna. I trust everybody. And I said, oh, she's just angry because of this false positive thing. It'll blow over. It's not an issue, blah, blah, blah. And so she called me, and it was clear they were attempting to cover up their misappropriation of federal funds. So there's a little quid pro quo going on there. The government sitting there saying, you'll keep your grants, you'll keep the money, you'll keep your institutes, you won't go to jail if you make sure nobody ever sees that data. Because what did my notebook say? They were like William Thompson's. What are we going to do about this? Was the names, these were the people, these were the true infected, this was the depth and breadth of the infection that had spread unchecked since the early 80s. That happened right at the same time as HIV. Now here we have 2 viruses, and one susceptible population gets one, and the other gets lifelong diseases like AIDS. So that, so the jailing and the arrest, Science the Journal said, we've lost confidence. And that blood working group paper that was entitled Failure to Confirm, that wasn't a failure to confirm paper, was published November 11th. So I was hiding on the boat between November 9th and November 14th when I came off the boat, because my husband found a lawyer through our church who said, oh, that's not a problem. And, and the lawyer was for wrongful termination and retaliation and RICO, it's called KETAM, for me whistleblowing on the situation. So that case never made it to court. It was held under seal for 5 years. And you know, when it was under seal means you can't even say you have a case. You can't get a lawyer because the government's considering going in on a whistleblowing case. And if the government comes in, then they take everything, and then they use the DOJ, and they use everything. And we've talked to the FBI literally since I got out of jail. And I hired a lawyer when I'm literally, you know, just my career's over. I've hired a lawyer to defend me from the FBI, because the FBI turns it around on you and says it's your fault, you did that. And I just know that because I grew up in Washington, D.C., and that's all discussed in the book. So
who was the director of FBI at that time? Was it Comey, or was it in 11? Was it Director Comey?
I have no idea. I think it was because he just lost his 15-year career retirement. And see, that's what they've threatened Frank Rossetti of. We'll fire you before the end of the fiscal year for fraud in your original science paper, and you and your wife will lose your 75 years combined retirement. And I said, Frank, I'm already under the bus, roll over me. But he kept his promise because you know, he's taken care of me since and funded and so that we could continue. And that's the last chapter of the book. So Frank Rossetti's an honest man and a scientist with integrity as well, who taught me, and he refused the same order that William Thompson has, which is throw away the data, burn all the samples so you can never track what this plague of corruption. And that was again November of 2011. So I'm held in jail, and you can follow the science articles from John Cohen and Martin Enserink. They said, oh, we're not part of the scientific staff. We're the op-eds. We just write. We're freelance writers, and we don't belong to the journal. And they wrote 22 articles. Beleaguered Institute keeps grants. Oh, okay. You know, they just got paid. Same thing with Bob Silverman. He got paid. His paper was retracted. They apologized to him because his honest mistake was, you know, when it's withdrawn, it's considered an honest mistake. When it's retracted, it's considered fraud. It was retracted. It wasn't an honest mistake. He took the bait. He took the buy off and the payoff, and let Judy Mikovits and Frank Rossetti take the, take it. And so again, they're just, you know, that's what that story's all about.
That's intense. Now but by the way, 2011 is very different than what happened in 2004 when you were forced to file bankruptcy with the whole perfect score, $10 million, 3 houses, boats, and everything you had, right?
That's 2014.
2014. So that's 2011. Then you have
Correct.
2014. Now, 2014 and 2011, do either one of them have anything to do with Dr. Anthony Fauci? Any influence with him at all?
Well, yes, both of them. Because
in what way?
Tony Fauci is NIAID. They funded our $5 million of grants. So again, in November, I think it was November 15th of 2011, Tony Fauci sends his grants administrators, and one of them's names was Kathy Laughlin. And they sent them to the Institute days before I was arrested, while they were, you know, I was hiding. And he says, and he goes there to make sure all the records are in order. We have everything. Okay, you keep your grants if everything's in order. So he sent, you know, his grants administrators to the Institute and checked the box saying it was all in order. Because at the time, they had no idea Max caught them in the act of the burglary on September 29th, the day before the end of the fiscal year. So we were going to rewrite history, much like William Thompson. Take those notebooks, write it in other things. We didn't do anything wrong. Here's the research. We didn't misappropriate funds. And so Anthony Fauci sends his grants administrators. He's the boss. You follow the money. He came in. He says it's all in order. It's all there. And all of a sudden, the big, oh my God, when they filed this civil lawsuit to me on November 4th, they had already filed a civil lawsuit saying that I stole their intellectual property. And one of the patients was a lawyer. and I needed to reply and send the letter in before a certain time the next day. And she was a lawyer. She wrote it in legal terms. She filed it, and she proved I could not possibly have done what they said I did. And I'm sure that was probably one of the funnier days in my life. The collective, no, where's the data? Where's the data? Where's the information? We thought we set up the perfect crime. And so that, and then when they couldn't find it, when they did their fake warrant, they came to my house, and they came to the house of the person not far away who faxed it for me, because I didn't have a fax machine. There were no computers in my house. There was no notebook. So even with this fake arrest, they ransacked our house, looked at everything, went to our friend's house, pushed her in a chair, held her there, couldn't find it at all. And so, they held me in jail until they could plant the evidence, extorted my then 73-year-old husband. You find it or she never goes home. You find it. They've held me there without a charge, without a lawyer, without anything for 5 days, trying to Epstein me. You mentioned this, trying to Epstein me, trying to get me to kill myself. You're there trying to figure out what the hell's going on, and it's not a pleasant situation. And my husband, he can't talk to me. He talks to me once, and you can see through both books how they set this whole thing up. And all I had to do, they had a bail hold. I couldn't even post bail, which was $100,000. I'm not a murderer. I don't have $100,000. And the bail bondsman in the first book said, I did this case on a signature because I knew how full of shit it was. I knew innocent people have no idea. They think our system works. They think they have due process. They think, and that's exactly what I said. What did Tony Fauci do? Oh, he told, he put a warrant out at the NIH. If I step foot on NIH property, I'm a fugitive from justice. That was still at Fort Detrick, November 15th, 2016, when I went there. So yes, where was Tony Fauci? He was the puppet master. He was directing the money. He was directing Ian Lipkin to do the now multi-center study, because they have a little problem with the blood working group. It's only 16 people. That's not a failure to confirm, that's fraud. And every one of those people should have been finished in their careers. On that paper, it actually published November 11th, and I didn't know that till 2 days ago. I thought it published on September 29th when I was September 22nd, when I was standing there giving the talk about the paper. So I could see how they carried out that threat from that phone call of September 4th, 2011, from my email of August 31st. So I have a paper trail, because I was told once, never put anything in the body of an email, put it in an attachment, because that's not discoverable. But my training from growing up in Washington, D.C. was, the minute he told me that, I asked myself why, and I put everything in the body of an email. So part of what they had to have was all my emails, all my computers, because Tony Fauci wrote the emails. I couldn't fly over NIH airspace. Really? What am I doing? Sprinkling virus over Frederick, Maryland, to visit my mother on her 75th birthday. Really?
So what is the difference between 2011 and 2014 event? 2014 event is...
So 2014, I haven't given up. I'm forced into bankruptcy. Why? So the criminal charges are dropped in the middle of June, after I'd proven my innocence on March 12th. The only time I ever talked to a criminal lawyer, I walked through every page of the notebooks and showed exactly the story I'm telling you, and proved that the perpetrators of the crimes were, these people I'm mentioning. So at any rate, the charges don't get dropped. My lawyer's made into a judge and removed from my case. The judge is proven to have been bought and paid for by the head of our institute, and And then he's actually convicted of campaign fraud for Harry Reid and sentenced to something right in June of 2012. The charges are dropped without prejudice. And what I'm told is the next time they will kill you. And I'm told that I'm not allowed to do Facebook. I'm not allowed to say a word. I'm not allowed to do any kind of social media or talk to anyone until the statute of limitations is up. And so then they're bringing their civil case to a damages hearing that was supposed to be September 4th of 2012. And I go with my bankruptcy lawyer and I actually go with my civil lawyer, who I name in the book, and my criminal lawyer and a bankruptcy lawyer are the same person, David J. Folan, here in Ventura. So we went into the office with my husband, and my civil lawyer says, I said, okay, I'm ready with my 97 witnesses, which included Tony Fauci, and 97 witnesses, the highest level of the government, to prove not only did I not do what you said I did nothing ethically wrong, and this was all a big cover up on this. And my lawyer, the civil lawyer, said, I won't go. And I said, and he said, do you think if you go and you testify against your employers, these powerful people who, literally bought Harry Reid more than one office, and in the Senate, I don't think he was ever legally elected. At any rate, scary thought. At any rate, it happened long before I met them in the 5 years, and it probably will go on forever. But at any rate, he said, if you go there and you present and you testify and you show everything we know to be true, the minute you step on the courthouse steps, you will be arrested because they will have found new evidence, and you'll be jailed in Nevada and you'll never get out. And I said, oh, that's ridiculous. There is no new evidence. And he looked at me and said, there was no evidence the first time, was there? And and I still do it to this day. The only time I cried. And he said, if you file bankruptcy right now before that hearing, then the charge is the civil case is stayed. So it never goes to a damages part, and your bankruptcy will simply say you lost your grants. It won't say you did anything wrong. There's no any kind of anything against you ever, and you can go out and live your life. And it was, I did not want to do it. And, then, these powerful people literally committed fraud in bankruptcy court and said I owed $15 million and I'd committed intellectual property theft, and I'd admitted to it. And they used Science, the Journal, and the other newspapers, and they literally fabricated everything as if I turned myself in. I didn't turn myself in. When I was let out of jail, they said, you go to Nevada and you get a criminal lawyer, or you're going right back to jail and you'll never see David again. And you come up with all of those computers and you come up with all those notebooks. And they told David the night before I was let go, the night before Thanksgiving, you don't come up with the notebooks and you'll never see her again. And they conveniently planted them in a linen beach bag in an open closet. My house was under construction. We were redoing the master bedroom and there was no closet door. Every other piece of paper was strewn across the house. And here's a beach bag with my initials on it, stacked to the top with the folders that were in those 2 desk drawers. Not 2 offices, not 30 years. It was planted there. And again, Michael Hugo proved that in the very little time he had to do discovery. They watched my house. They hunted me down between September and whatever time in November. And they just fabricated these crimes in order to shut me down forever. So I'm full on bankrupt. It said I owed $15 million. When you commit intellectual property theft, you'll never work again, not even at Starbucks, because you'll steal the money. So the director, everything I'd ever had, was lost. And worse, right after that, they published the fraud that was the multi-center study with Ian Lipkin as the last author that Tony Fauci stopped. When against all odds, I'm going through all this in the summer. I'm doing retrovirology by telephone. Frank's not even good enough with a camera to take the picture of the microscope and show me on a computer. We're biologists. And I said, that's what you're looking for. And he's like, this one? And I said, that's what you're looking for. That's what you're looking for. And then we would have gotten them positive. And Fauci stepped in and said, it's contamination. It's all contamination. We're stopping the wasting of government money now, as if these patients didn't deserve the entire study to be finished. And then he told Frank that they'd use all the cohorts equally. So it was pretty clear that because they'd done thousands of samples, it was now contamination. Harold Varmus committed fraud because he added the synthetic infectious molecular clone. So that changed the study design because we couldn't do our isolation because the molecular clone grows so much faster, like 100 times faster than the natural isolate. So we couldn't afford the contamination. So we didn't do that part of the study, and against all odds, it was still positive. They published the paper in September, October of 2012. As I'm going through this, this bankruptcy stuff, forced into it, not even knowing what's going on because I can't read a paper. I can't get on the internet. I can't do anything. I have only what Frank Rossetti tells me. They apply the statistics. They publish this paper. Our names are on it because, I don't have a choice. I'm being told everybody knows I was told 3 times by Ian Lipkin, and so was Frank Rossetti and Tony Fauci, that everybody knew there were other of these family of viruses in these people, just not that virus in the patients, just not that sequence. You could only look for that sequence because that's what you said. No, that's not what we said. That's what Bob. So it's this kind of wrangling. And then I said they had a super secret conference call on when the study was unblinded. So you've done like 1,000 in each center. We test from each clinical sample, and Harvey Alter and Shai-Xing Lo, they do their test and we do our test. So that when it's unblinded, it's super secret. There are only 3 men on the phone: Harold Varmus, Francis Collins, and Tony Fauci. And they're on the phone and they say, there's no association. And I'm sitting in my car in front of LAX. And it's another time when I'm almost crying. And I said, that's okay. There's still 6% in the controls. There was 6% in the patients. There was 6% in the controls. And I said, that's okay. That's still 25 million Americans who we can prevent from ever getting disease. So what did the paper say at the end of the abstract? There was no evidence of infection, and clearly table 3 of that paper shows evidence of infection. So, it was the end of my career. Never heard from Ian Lipkin again, who had promised me a job. Within weeks, Tony Fauci awards him $34 million to create a center for discovery and diagnostics. And who did he fund with that money a few years ago? Oh, the North Carolina group working with the Wuhan Chinese, looking at coronaviruses as they've done the last 10 years. So Tony Fauci funded the coronavirus studies with Wuhan, with North Carolina, with Switzerland and Harvard. It's right there in the paper. The cell lines they grew the virus came from Fort Detrick. We know those have HIV in them, and God only knows what else. Oh yeah, that one makes me sick.
Dr. Judy, question for you. What is the motive behind this? Is it money? Is it big pharma? Is it power? What is it? I mean, what is the real motive behind it?
Well, the real motive behind it's all of those things up until 2011, and now you've committed crimes against humanity. This is treason. This is prison. This is worse than that. This is cover up. The motive is cover it up. So what are we doing in COVID? Oh, we're burying them without any evidence of coronavirus. What if it's XMRV plus coronavirus? That's what all the clinical data suggests, because, they have the exact same things. They have the coagulopathies. They have the bleeding disorders. Coronaviruses don't cause bleeding disorders. Coronaviruses don't cause heart attacks and postural orthostatic tachycardia. Retroviruses do. These viruses do. You know, the motive, cover up. I mean, it's trillions. And then force everybody to get the vaccines so they can say you had it all along. Kill them. You're going to kill the people with these viruses. You're going to kill me. You're going to kill my husband. And you're going to bury us and call it COVID if we get a vaccine, because we're the ones that will respond, because we've already been infected with that flame that's so high that it can drive an almost instant heart attack, cardiac arrest, or drive our the Alzheimer's disease, the autism. ME is a very serious disease where your brain and your muscles can't function. You just literally die. These it's a mitochondrial disease. These are the people who will die because they're carrying the infection. That's that 25 million in 2011. It's almost 100 million now because we've ramped up the vaccine program. We cleaned up the blood supply because I told them how. So the motive is so much more than money. The motive is cover up and kill the victims and make sure nobody ever exhumes them and sees that there really was no evidence of that infection in their death, but look what else was here. And that's the worst thing about this disease. What make them wear masks? I wear a mask, I will die. I will activate my latent viruses, my sleeping viruses, and I will drive the pathology in myself. I stress out. I'm afraid. How do I make any money? It doesn't matter. I'm kind of looking forward to that stimulus. I made $2,000 in a month in 10 years or so. That would be kind of cool. But at any rate, I mean, I didn't see it in my checking account, but anyway, I don't expect to either. But so, these people, the people who are most at risk, the last thing they can do is wear a mask. The last thing they can do is stay out of the sunshine. The last thing, because you're going to activate internally and you're going to suppress your immune system and you're going to replicate. You're going to cause that fire to go out of control because you woke up all those sleeping viruses. And that's what the clinical data support. Most of our patients will use the term air hunger. So using the ventilators is killing people because you have to paralyze them and in order to put that through with fentanyl and other drugs, in order to put that ventilator down their throat, when they're desaturating their oxygen, their iron is leaving and going into the blood, and that adds to the flame. That adds to the signature of disease. We published the signature of disease. The signature of disease of chronic fatigue syndrome associated, let's just call it XMRV, that virus, that paper we published in the spring of 2011 is exactly the one they're calling COVID signature of disease. So what are we really looking at? I think it's the biggest cover up, and honestly, because of what the last chapter of this book says, got to do something. We got all the data, folks. You didn't succeed at getting the data. You didn't succeed at getting the samples. Every one of them goes to jail when we give, and that's the point about 2014. I forgot the dead man's trigger on the book, because that would mean Dr. Frank and I would be killed. What's the dead man's trigger on the book? When Frank was forced into retirement in May of 2014, he brought all of the samples, and he brought all of the paper to my office. To my house, in my apartment in Carlsbad, in the big recycling bin. They told him to throw it away. And, he threw it in the recycling bin, and he was watched by an armed guard in Fort Detrick when he's leaving there. The armed guard left at 5 o'clock, and Frank never left at 5 o'clock, and he just simply put it in the wrong place. So he knocked on my door in May of 2014 and said, I don't know how this shit got in my moving van. I took one look at that recyclable bin, and I could see every paper I could see, because investigators have to keep a copy of your records of everybody on the project. They took all of mine, and they told Frank to William Thompson style destroy the data, as they had done all the way back then. But Frank knew it was a federal offense. So I spent the next 3 days scanning every bit of it into hard drives. And then I made an appointment with David Folan, and we called the FBI, and we handed them that hard drive. And I have the receipt for it. We taped every word of the conversation in 2014. I had a lawsuit. That was under seal. The government hasn't decided whether they're going to pick up this whistleblower, Ketam, RICO, racketeering and conspiracy case. And again, under seal until October of 2019, when I gave exactly this talk in 20 quick slides and showed the association with Tony Fauci and everything I just told you today. With the Monday after I gave that Friday talk, the case was dismissed with prejudice, meaning you can't come back again. You made it all up for the greater glory of whatever it is in your book. So this was the explosive talk that really changed everything because people saw it.
Your extensive research with vaccines and everything that you've done, and you're seeing a lot of people, my family, I have those that are absolutely anti-vaccine. I have those who are pro-vaccine. I was in the military. So, when you join the military, they give you all these shots, 11 shots on day one because you're military property.
Right.
And we have those that are in the middle, and you see the stories about vaccine being linked to autism and the business aspect of it behind it. Can you go into that a little bit when you talk about it in the book with the money part of how much autism makes and how much it costs for a kid from the moment they have it to 18 years old?
Yeah, it costs literally millions of dollars to take care of them. It had, and that would be the cost on the government because they unwittingly caused it, if you will, because it was unwitting until really recent events, as we see more and more research on how these things can happen. And that was the benefit of us working in vaccine court. Well, in vaccine court, all they have to pay per case of, say, SIDS death or the damage of Gardasil or even autism is $250,000. So when you kill somebody, a life is $250,000. But the cost of taking care of some of these severely injured kids would be in the tens of millions. They need round the clock caretakers, because they escape, they run, they hurt, they don't know what they're doing. They have superhuman strength. The biology of it is simply astounding. And that would break the bank. So it's not just autism, but the ITP. So that's a fatal blood disease. So ITP is a fatal blood disease, a bleeding disorder. And we're even seeing, as I mentioned, ITP and other blood diseases attributed to COVID. So, the money is in the trillions, and I can't even estimate that but again, in just vaccine court alone, there was fraud committed in the 3,000 or so. It's called the Ombudsman case. And we went through it in great detail in the book. My Hugo giving a couple chapter for that book. It's called My Stolen Identity. And so how these courts literally kept the case that would have proved these 3,000 cases back 15 or 20 years ago, that if one case, so they do 5 test cases, and if one case turns out that the vaccine did cause the autism in that child, everybody gets paid off. Everybody gets paid. That then would have broken the program and ended the vaccine program as we knew it. And it was at least 2005 I'm not even sure when it was, but that's what Bobby Kennedy knew. So that's what, and the lawyers that I worked for in the vaccine court. So I looked because I wanted to see the cytokine storms, and you see them over and over and over again, being why a person is susceptible. And again, the complexity of the ingredients in the vaccine alone, which nobody's ever tested them. No safety tests for, 36 years.
I see numbers here that it says it costs $3 million for the lifetime cost of a child that's autistic, $3 million. And currently, 1 in 54 child in America has autism, 74 million children in America. If you take 3 million times 1.4 million children, that's $4.2 trillion. That's $233 billion a year on cost.
Right.
Is that a form of business for big pharma, or who makes that money?
Right now, the families take that burden. It should be the families don't have Medicare. Their kids aren't, their
The
kids are
family's
just,
taking that burden.
yes, the family takes that burden. The schools take that burden. The taxpayers take that burden as the taxpayers pay that court fee.
What is that? By the way, so then you hear about the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. It sounds like it protects the child, but the way it's worded, it sounds like it protects the child, but it's the complete opposite.
Correct.
How does that work?
It's because of the corruption of the court. It was intended to protect the child. But things like the ombudsman things, it was intended to bring a quick release because, and that's what you'll read from Michael Hugo, when they were doing these DTP cases back in the 70s and 80s, they would string them out until the family simply couldn't afford it anymore. And you're trying to take care of this massively injured child in wheelchair, drooling, the brain injury, the seizures. You're trying to find anything to help your kid. You can't keep your job. You've got to stay home and take care of them. You can't educate them because they're dangerous in school to themselves and to others. Yeah. And so the court became corrupted. And that's that chapter called Stolen Identity. And I said in a recent talk, I believe it was with Thomas Paine, the pundit, a few weeks ago, I said it in the book. I saw a lot of evil, as we just heard in the last hour or so, and nothing compared to what I saw in this court. I mean, Frank Rossetti said, I can't do it anymore, Judy. This is killing me. So all we were doing is we were expert witnesses. And I'd see these innocent patients. We're following the medical record like a murder mystery of how the kid gets hurt. And, I'm looking like this, like it's Alfred Hitchcock. Please don't give him another shot. And the doctor assures him, no, it didn't happen. No, it didn't happen. It has nothing to do with it. It's coincidence. And the parent, if the parent is bullied, and that's the end of their child's life. And literally in some cases, their lineage. These kids can't have kids. These kids, that's the end of whole families. In one of the cases that we were doing, and it's really tough for me. They blame the families, and one little girl developed seizures after a Gardasil shot, and they said she had a family history of seizures, and oh, by the way, the mother was a druggie and whatever else they try to say to these families. And at the end of our expert report, they wrote on her death certificate, natural causes. They almost got her well after the first shot started the seizures and severe seizures, and she got fat and she had to take the drugs in there. And so she stopped the seizures. The drugs eventually got control of the situation. And they said, okay, she's well, give her the second shot. And they killed her. She died in her sleep, and they wrote natural causes, and I wrote in our report that the causation as I walked through the disease process of biological, and the last line was, her grandfather went to her funeral. It's not natural causes. This is not the natural progression of her seizure disorder. She didn't have a seizure disorder till that shot. Just because we have genetic susceptibilities and these diseases are in our family somewhere, doesn't mean we have to die of that disease. And that's really, over and over again, this court, nothing about it. It's not a court because there's no discovery. The vaccine is considered innocent at all costs, and the families that brave the court are just astounded by, well, wait a minute, we didn't do anything wrong, our child is sick. What they do to those families and those children and those people in this courtroom, I can only take my hats off to the few who have stuck it out and at least won and helped others, because we can see and we can prevent the injury. That's the only reason I do it as a research scientist, because we go in and the people, our lawyers say, Judy, will you call the family and give them some help? Because I know the natural products and the drugs that can at least stop the progression of the disease.
Question for you. What do you say to those that say there's a something going on with depopulation? There's a motive behind the scenes that someone's trying to depopulate, someone's trying to reduce population growth. Do you subscribe to any of that?
No, I mean,
Okay.
I didn't before this, but as I see the number of kids that are, I've learned some of the recent data about kids that are sterilized from Gardasil, and so you know, you have to look at you know, I'm not that person that says, you know, I'm just a scientist.
Got
I
it.
don't need conspiracy theories. It's just not me.
That's
Never
but
has.
that actually gives you credibility because you're not jumping on anything that anybody else saying, and you're just kind of telling us that you're a scientist and that's your specialty. That's what you're mainly focused on. So with today, with coronavirus that we're going through, three questions that some of the people that are close to me ask. So we know we have some kind of we have the cure for AIDS, whether it's a cure, if it's a method of at least working against it, cancer, coronavirus. If you yourself right now, God forbid you yourself got coronavirus, how are you going to treat yourself? You know, if you were, it's Dr. Judy, you go, you find out you have coronavirus, how would you cure yourself?
Well, that's easy. I already did it. Type 1 interferon. Type 1 interferon, a spray in my mouth. I'm preventing it. I'm not just, I told you, if I get it, I'm one of the ones who can get most severely ill because I have these other issues from the viruses they gave me. At any rate, I use a type 1 interferon spray, very, very low dose. That very thing I made, I learned of March 31st, 1980, my very first job. It cost pennies to the dollar. I prevent with zinc. I would be getting a prescription for the hydroxychloroquine. I would be doing all the things that I always do, prevent that cytokine storm, make sure I'm not eating GMO, Roundup, glyphosate, because that's depleting your oxygen and we don't want to deplete our oxygen. I would stay off planes simply because of the oxidative stress over ozone layers. I would drink natural products, juices, which I carry with me should I have to travel, because I can have those things. So I would prevent the disease development even if I got the infection.
What do you say about folks? I heard a doctor the other day talk about zinc, and then he talked about quinine, and then he talked about tonic water. What do you have to say about that?
Well, quinine is the basis, the quinolones, the quinine, that's what hydroxychloroquine, the Plaquenil, these anti-malarial drugs were originally quinine based. You know, so yeah, you know, tonic water, quinine, I use liver bitters and things like that. So these are very valuable nutritional therapies. And again, I use a hot lemon water because it's breathing in the lemon, the vitamin C, you can kill in your nasal passages if you heat it up. I use eucalyptus on a vaporizer. So I just vaporize, open up my lungs. You know, we used to do this as kids. So just enable myself to breathe, support my immune system with, you know, we know zinc has many antiviral properties. And with the hydroxychloroquine, it opens up the channels so the zinc can get in. And so you can use low dose zinc and things like that. You don't want to use high dose of anything. I don't necessarily ascribe to some of the things like intravenous, you know, vitamin C, that can be quite toxic. And again, there's a whole landscape of whatever's going on. So just low dose nutritional therapies. I don't eat GMO. I eat healthy eggs. I keep myself out in the sunshine with natural vitamin D. I just prevent, and I will not wear a mask. No, because that'll suppress my own immune system. You're not made to breathe dirty air. You know, I'm not coughing right now. So I do have childhood pleurisy, so I am susceptible. But I'm not caught. And pleurisy means fluid in the lungs. So I'm amplifying any coronavirus infection should I get infection, because it needs fluid to live, and it's that dry cough and things like that. But I'm not coughing, so I can't possibly spread the virus. These viruses live, when you say aerosolized, they live in water droplets. Dry air is not water droplets. Yes, if you cough or sneeze, a tiny little droplet containing virus can go. This is how we transmit things like influenza every year. But I certainly wouldn't get a vaccine of live flu viruses, which cause upper respiratory infections, and then put on a mask and amplify those live attenuated flu viruses and cripple my immune system that needs to respond to the infection. So I would simply strengthen my immune system, and again, we're preventing natural herd immunity by not letting the people who have recovered, who are immune, who are asymptomatic, they're not spreading virus. If you're asymptomatic, by definition, you're not coughing droplets of coronavirus on people. It's not how it works. And so we don't wear masks. We've never worn masks with the common cold and influenza. If I'm taking care of my husband, for example, who has COPD, every year I prevent him from getting any kind of microbial infection the same way. So I'm not treating, yes, I do keep him at home more. Yes, I do insist he take beach walks and stay outside and keep his immune system up and not eat so much crap and drink, we use tonic water. So we put tonic water with our lemon and we got a little quinine. You don't need much, and you don't need much for any of these. And he hasn't been sick. He got his COPD from a microbial infection when he was in his 30s. He's now 81 and he hasn't been sick in years. He's fine.
You hear a lot about the risk of people like yourself to come out and talk, whether it's being a whistleblower. How much of that does that still happen in the medical world where folks are coming out? Is it pretty common for folks to come out and fight the system to have something happen to them, even getting killed?
It's really not as common as it would be because of things like how journals and your career is destroyed or your life is destroyed. And we had a whole chapter in our book about people who did get killed, who realized the truth and stood up for the truth and lost their lives or lost their careers, much like I do. So most people, no, it's not as common as it should be. But
why are you doing this? Why are you talking? Why are you coming out and speaking? The man you're speaking against, he's on TV every other second of the day. He's on everybody's Facebook Live. He's on everybody's Instagram Live. He's on TV with Trump all the time. I'm talking about Dr. Anthony Fauci, and you're talking about him a lot. Why are you doing this?
Well, it's simply said, when Frank Ruscetti came back in 1983, and Tony Fauci, and he found out what I had done, and he said, you did not giving him the paper. He said, you did that for me. And I said, no, asshole, I did it because it's the right thing to do. And from that day on, we've been fast friends because there's no other thing you can do. It's integrity. I didn't do it for you. I did it because it's the only thing I know how to do. It's the only, and I haven't just come out 2 weeks ago. These books are 10 years worth of work. We've got everything taped, my career, every time I lost a job from insolence and insubordination. I never lost a job for any other reason.
You're a rebel, that's for sure. So this is the last part of the interview. I will name a couple different organizations. You tell me the first word that comes to mind, and then I'll give you a few names and tell me the first thing that comes to mind. CDC.
Center for Dishonesty and Corruption.
Okay. FDA.
Same idea. They're corrupt. The only thing they're supposed to be protecting the safety of food and drugs, and they've done nothing about the safety of GMOs. They're corrupt. They have no authority. They gave themselves authority for efficacy of drugs, and the FDA closed them. They're corrupt.
NIH.
Still NIH's National Institutes of Health. I still think most people in those organizations are attempting to make our health better. And most of my colleagues, we never did anything in the National Cancer Institute or anything else other than take care. They're mostly honest people. It's the top that needs to be changed.
OIG.
Oh, is that Office of Inspector General?
Yes.
We submitted Frank submitted a complaint to them about the lack of ethics before anything ever happened to me. And my lawyer called and said, or the lawyers called him and said, withdraw it and it will go easier for you. So corrupt. They're not protecting anybody but themselves.
Here's some names. Mike Hugo.
Oh, I love him. he's a fabulous, honest lawyer with integrity. He goes back all the way to the 80s. He was winning the cases to prevent those kids. He genuinely wrote that law for the Vaccine Injury Compensation Act with the hope that it would help these people that had been injured get something quick and end the suffering.
Harry Reid.
That's bad. Let me think of a nicer way to say it. A puppet. A puppet.
John Cohen.
A criminal investigative reporter. He purports fear, corruption. He drives the corruption. John Cohen is that reporter, and I wrote him an email. How unethical. I'm proud of what I did. Really? You're proud of what you did? You're proud of what you did? You know it's not the truth. You're proud of this? You're proud of that? Where is he now when the CDC admitted their tests were false positive? Hey, send this article out, John. Sorry. That's one I'd like to see in prison forever.
He'd be at the top of your list?
No, not the top of my list.
Okay, but he'd be on the list.
Got a long list.
George Orwell.
We're kind of living it, aren't we? 1984. Yeah, that's what this is.
Dr. Frank Rossetti.
No, my best friend and just a man of total integrity, and he's absolutely a genius. He sees things other people don't see. As
Bobby
far as
Kennedy.
science. Bobby Kennedy, I've come to respect that man. Just respect is the word for his willingness to go to bat and really learn. He doesn't just say something. He doesn't do the investigation.
Deborah Birx.
Scarf lady. Okay. A buffoon. She's committed crimes in the 80s and HIV against the military, and they destroyed families. She's right there doing the same thing. She knows that there's no such thing as asymptomatic carriers. Oh, so we'll let you go. We'll do a release and we'll let everybody out of their house. And then, but don't get too far, because as soon as the summer's over, it's coming back. No, if you have antibodies, you're immune. Stop this. Why are you redefining immunology? Because you can, and it covers up your crime. So this just is more of the same. She should have been convicted a long time ago, along with Robert Redfield of the CDC. They perpetrated these frauds all the way against in HIV/AIDS in the 80s and 90s.
How about Tedros, the director of CDC?
Don't know him at all. No comment.
President Trump.
Think he's trying the best he can to honor the Constitution and honor his promises to the people. And I just don't think there's any way when everybody's lying to you at the top of what real healthcare is. He's not a scientist. He shouldn't be expected. He should be able to trust his leaders.
Bill Gates.
He knows nothing about medicine. He doesn't have a medical degree. $1 billion doesn't. Nobody elected him anything. $1 billion doesn't allow him to become a doctor and decide who gets what vaccines and who can't leave their home, just because he has all the money. Francis
Collins.
I think I said a puppet. He's a good man. He tried to do the right thing, and Tony Fauci overruled him, and that's the way I feel about him.
Harold Varmus.
Harold Varmus, Nobel laureate. He was brought back to head the National Cancer Institute with only one thing in mind: make that virus go away and destroy Frank Rossetti. And
last but not least, Dr. Anthony Fauci.
Again, treason is what he should be charged with, and he should go right now. As far as and all of the money. The last slide of that Truth About Cancer talk was all of these things be closed, give the people the money you stole, reorganize all of HHS, Health and Human Services, and start over. We'll rebalance the budget will quickly, and the victims of these crimes will get restored, and we can use these health measures that all those brilliant people at the NIH have done for 40 years to bring about a new health for our country like we've never seen before.
Dr. Judy, I'll give you the final word. You know, audience is listening. They've heard a lot. You've talked about a lot of different things. What do you want to share with them? Your final thoughts.
I've said it a couple of times in other places because I feel it within our families, and that is forgive yourselves and forgive each other. None of us could have possibly known. The investigators in the laboratories, the scientists, Dr. Rossetti, our families, we trusted doctors who weren't taught. They were taught something that was untrue. And I think that's why I have this baseball hat on for Vax 2, the Vax 2, the movie, The People's Truths. Watch it. And you see the pain, and you see the doctors say they weren't told about vaccines. You see, once somebody learns the truth, you see the families where one child is injured, and the child, and the children that don't get vaccinated. The healthy people don't make people sick. They're the healthiest, and yet they have to forgive the parents and the siblings because of what it does to a family structure. So if we can forgive each other and forgive ourselves, I think that's how we can usher in just a new world of peace and health again, and joy like we haven't seen in decades.
Dr. Judy, thank you for being a guest and speaking here for over 2 hours and trying to do your best to speak our language, since we're not in your world and we don't understand all the wording. I thought you did a phenomenal job speaking our language where we understood. Again, thank you for what you're doing and your bravery. If you haven't purchased her book, we're going to put a link below to get the book, Plague of Corruption, and go out there and buy the book and tell your peers about it. Dr. Judy, thanks again for being a guest on Valuetainment.
Thanks, Patrick. I really
appreciate you. Thank you.
You know, it's different when you're talking to scientists who majored in chemistry and biology, because she could, with her knowledge, just absolutely educate you with technical terms, and I thought she did a good job being able to communicate message to the rest of us. And it's pretty intense with the experience she had with Dr. Fauci and what happened as a fugitive and hiding on a boat for 4 days and 5 days and all this. Just a very random story that she had. But I'm curious to know what you took away from it. Comment below. I want to know what you took away from this. And if you like this one, I have 2 other interviews I want you to watch. One is with Dr. Buttar, who also went a complete different angle with what's going on. He's somebody that's not happy with what's going on today with coronavirus. He had a different take about it. So click if you want to watch this one, or if you want to hear from more the economy standpoint, Danielle DiMartino Booth, who was an advisor to the Federal Reserve of Dallas for 9 years, she talks about the economic effects of what coronavirus could happen. Click on this, and if you've not subscribed to the channel, please do so. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.